So if you want to make it mandatory, engine object creation, if you want to make it mandatory for car class, before going to create car class object, if you want to make mandatory of engine object, then you can go through one concept, depends on. Dependency checking is for just to make setter dependency injection mandatory. By using depends on, you can apply dependencies for classes. One class, if it have a dependency on any other class, by using depends on, you can apply that class as a dependency for your class. By using depends on, usually while building MVC based application, complete MVC based application, we need to build controller part and model part. Under model part, we need to build business classes and DAO classes. Under controller part, controller, and finally presentation. Here, to execute user use cases, to pass user inputs, controller is required, and the controller, it is having dependency of business. Without business class object, controller is not required here. And without DAO class, I don't require any business class. Without performing database operations, if my business class executes, also no use, right? Without business class, if my controller class executes, also no use. In case, if you want to create controller class object, if the class name is A, and if business class name, if it is B, and if it is DAO class name, if it is C. And if you have tightly dependency, if you have dependency, compulsory dependency of business, and business if it is having compulsory dependency of DAO. While before creating A class object, if you want to make B class object creation mandatory, while before creating B class object, if you want to make it C class object mandatory, then you can apply depends on. A have depends on B, and B is having dependency on C. So by using depends on, you can apply one class can depends on other classes. So without creating this class objects, container will not create this class object. So first container need to create C class object, then next it need to create B class object. In case if these two classes objects creation success, then only it will come to create A class object. So the type of dependencies, if you want to apply for one class to another class, you can go through this depends on concept. Class A, class B, write simple default constructors, system.out.println A object, B class constructor, system.out.println B object. Class C, system.out.println C object. So if you want to apply dependency here, if A class, if it having dependency on B, and if it have dependency on C, you can apply this dependency checking through your Spring XML file. By using attribute, depends on attribute in your Spring XML file, create beans, bean ID, A class name, A class, and here you can use this depends on attribute, depends on. bean id C, class name C class, depends on attribute. So now to apply A depends on B, B depends on C, you need to configure this references keyword. If you configure B reference keyword, then before creating A class object, container must need to create B class object. So if you apply like this, first which class object it will create? B class object it will create, then it will create A class object. If B is having dependency on C, then here first which class object it will create? First C class object container will create, then it will go for B, finally it will create A class object. Again if you apply depends on A, we should not apply. Okay, if you apply A here, A is having dependency on B, B is having dependency on C. Again if C depends on A, okay, if they have mutual dependencies, then it is not possible to create objects. Mutual dependencies we should not put. Finally C should not have depends on A, or C should not have depends on B. Two beings, they should not have any mutual dependencies. If they have mutual dependencies, then it is not possible to create that class objects. If you say while creating B class object, B is having dependency on C. If you say here C is having dependency on B, then which object container need to create, B or C? It will confuse, right? So mutual depends are not possible here. Mutual dependencies are not possible. Mutual dependencies are not possible. Mutual dependencies are not possible. Create a Java project, depends on add IOC dependencies, and create three classes: A, create a B class, create a C class. Now apply dependencies. Create a resource, and beans id A class reference, class name beans.a class. Without dependencies, if you try to load, based on order it will create this classes objects. Without having any dependencies, if you try to load your XML file into IOC container, while loading itself, advanced container will create objects, right? If you are using J2EE container, while loading your XML document itself, it will create all the declaration class objects. So here if you load application context AP equal to new class path application context, resources slash string.xml file, ap.getBean of okay, no need to call any bean. Just if you try to load, it will create A and B and C class objects. All the bean declaration objects it will create while loading itself. So here creating based on declaration order. A we declared first, so A class object creating first, then next B, and the next C objects creating. In case if we change that order, based on order only it will create. First B, the next A, the next C objects it will create. So object creation, container will create based on order. Here we don't have any preferences. Based on order only it will create. In case if you want to apply that preferences to your beans, then you have to apply dependency checking. In case before creating A class object or before creating B class object, if you want to apply dependency, depends on C. So before creating B class object, container it will try to create C class object. So now if I run, which object first it will create? C, then next B, then next A. C object, B object and A object. So for C, if I apply depends on A, for C if you apply this depends on A, then first which object it will create? First A, then next C, finally B. ACB. Okay. So for A, if you want to apply dependency, if I apply dependency for A, what happens here? B is having dependency on C, is having dependency on A is having dependency on again B. In chain they have again dependencies. So these dependencies are not possible. If you try to run, what container will do? Container throwing exception. Continuing exceptions in these two methods while trying to getting bean. If it find any mutual dependencies, complete exception stack here it is printing. Okay, it is not possible anyways. Okay, so by using this dependency checking, if one class, if it having dependency on any other class, you can apply that class dependency. Yeah. Okay. So as for this session, we know we can apply dependency checking by using two ways to our primitive types and secondary types, by using dependency check and by using required annotation. And for classes, if you want to apply that dependency while creating objects, first if you want to create one class object, instead of following order, you can go through depends on. And I'll show you setter and constructor dependency injection once again. Setter dependency injections and constructor dependency injections, but not by using simple approach. We have P namespace and C namespace. Like our util namespaces, we have property namespace and constructor namespaces. By using these namespaces, just I'll show you here how to inject data into setter and how to inject data into constructor. You can do setter dependency injection and constructor dependency injection by using P and C namespace. So if I go through this P and C namespace, I can reduce number of XML tags. So then you can improve performance while reading XML document. So I'll show you both the differences, the normal approach and in case of this P and C namespace, how we need to inject. If you have a class, with string name, and if you have a setter method here, this setter method you can call in two ways, by using P namespace or else by using simple property tag. So to pass these values into this setter, the first approach, while declaring your bean class, bean id, t, class name, test class, into this bean by using property tag, property name equal to name, and we can pass value here. This one is old approach. By using property tag you can do this. Instead of using this property tag, by using P namespace also you can do this. P namespace, where I have to add this namespace, where we have to add XML namespaces under main root tag, XML namespace, XML ns, P namespace you have to add here, P namespace you have to add. Then by using this P namespace also you can do setter dependency injection, create bean id c, okay, bean id t, test class reference, and the class name test class. And here instead of using property tag you can use P namespace, but where we have to use this P namespace, not in between bean and bean. P namespace just we have to use under bean tag, bean id t, class name, test class. Here I can use that P namespace. P colon, if it is a primitive type, P colon, if you have a primitive type, then directly you need to call that primitive type name, P colon name, P colon name, and you can pass that name value here. In case if you have any secondary type, if it contains any secondary type, private, if it have any secondary type here, if test class, if it is having dependency of car, okay. So here if it is having dependency of car, then how to pass that car value? Property name car, and that car value by using what we need to pass? By using reference. By using reference we can pass it. By using reference you need to create car reference, bean id, see class name, car class, then this car class reference you have to pass here. For primitive type you have to use value, for secondary type you have to use a reference under property tag. So here if you want to pass that car value, if you have bean id car, and if you have car object, if you want to inject that car reference by using P namespace, if you want to call secondary type setter method, you can call P colon car hyphen reference. You can pass that car reference here. To pass secondary object you have to use that secondary attribute name and as well as hyphen reference. For primitive type, just you have to call only property name. For secondary type, you have to call property name hyphen reference name, reference hyphen reference you must need to place. Getting the difference? In case of simple type, you need to create a bean class car object, and if you want to inject that car object and as well as name into test class, you need to call two property tags here, right? Property name and the value, that property required value, and for one more property car and the reference. If it is secondary type, that reference you need to pass. In case of normal property tags, instead of using property tags, if you want to go through this simple namespace, by using this namespace, then you can call p colon name, your attribute name, and for secondary type, p colon your attribute name and hyphen reference you have to use for secondary types. In case if you want to do constructor dependency injection here, if you have a constructor with a string name and a car. So to call constructor, instead of using property tag, what we have to use here? We have to use constructor hyphen arg. Then what we have to use there? Instead of adding p namespace, we have to add c namespace. Then, like how you are calling p namespace properties, in the same way you can call c namespace properties. C colon car reference. Then what it will call, if you pass two parameters, c colon name and c colon reference, how many attributes we are trying to passing? 2. It will try to search for 2 attributes constructor. So if it find a 2 parameterized constructor, 2 parameters constructor, it will try to call that constructor. Into that constructor it will pass this ABC primitive name and secondary type car reference. Okay. So by using this p and c namespace, we can reduce this number of tag declarations here. You can reduce number of tag declarations, and by loading this XML file document into your parsers, you can reduce that number of XML processing time. That number of XML tags processing time you can reduce.